What is up, guys? Welcome back to Anthology of Heroes, the podcast sharing stories of heroism and defiance from across the ages. Today, we're going to mix things up a bit. With the help of one of my favourite historians, like ever, we've got some Crusader history for you. Roger Crowley is a standout British historian and author. His book, 1453, The Holy War for Constantinople and the Clash of Islam in the West, was really one of the books that got me into history. Roger's use of real-life quotes from contemporaries makes for an incredibly visceral reading experience. It helped me realize history doesn't need to be boring and dry. It also got me hooked on Constantine the 11th, which sent me down one of my first history rabbit holes. And I wasn't the only one, it seems, because when Netflix put together their series, Ottoman Rising, about the rise of Sultan Mehmet II, Roger was one of the experts the producers cut to in between the scenes for narratives. But that's a story for another time. Today, Roger is guiding us through the 1291 Siege of Akka. You may not have heard about this siege, but it's a pivotal moment in history, because this little city on the Levant coast, today part of Israel, was the very last Crusader city standing. A lot of people forget that even after Jerusalem was retaken by the Muslims, there were still a handful of little cities bustling with life, a Christian needle in a Muslim haystack. I visited Akka last year, and it tweaked my memory of Roger's book, The Accursed Tower, The Fall of Acre and the End of the Crusades. Looking out at the harbour, I spotted a little bit of floating debris and speculated that that might be the remains of one of the famous Crusader-era towers that fell during this siege. I shot an email over to Roger, who confirmed that what I was looking at was, in fact, the remains of the Tower of Flies. From there, we got talking, and, well, the rest is history. If you've listened to our last interview with James Waterson, this story takes place not long after where we left off there. Sultan Baybars, who James explained in detail, is a key character in this story too. You don't need to listen to that episode first, but if you're one of those people who like to start from the very beginning, go check that one out. Without further ado, the man, the legend, Mr. Roger Crowley. Hi, Roger. Thanks very much for joining me on the Anthology of Heroes show. How are you today?
Thanks very much, Elliot. I'm delighted to be here talking to you, and I'm fine.
Oh, good to hear. All right. Well, today we're going to be talking through your book, which details the 1291 Siege of Akka. So I guess my first question would be, what made you want to write a whole book on just this event?
I think because I'm interested in kind of breakpoint moments in history, and Siege and Fall of Acre was sort of symbolic, really, I suppose, of the end of the Crusades. I mean, you know, it isn't the end of the Crusades, but it is the moment that really showed that it was over, although people didn't fully take in immediately that it was over. And that kind of last stand thing usually throws up sort of incredibly dramatic narratives of attack and defense, and of two completely opposing ideologies and religions.
Well, can you give me a bit of a background on the Levant before this siege kicked off? Obviously, the Crusaders have been losing land for a while, but how do we get to this point, I suppose?
We get to this point as a result of events around 1260 in Cairo. The Ayyubid dynasty, which has been the ruling dynasty in Egypt and Syria and the Middle East, is faltering. And the Ayyubids depend upon slave army of what they call Mamluks, captured people. And what happens around 1260 is that the slaves become the masters. There's a coup. The Ayyubid, last Ayyubid Sultan is killed. And these are Turkish-speaking outsiders who become the lords of Cairo. Not terribly popular with the local Arabic people. They're Turkish speakers. They're great soldiers. They're enslaved people from, rather like the Mongols, from Central Asia, but they migrated west and were probably on the steppes of the of the North Black Sea coast. And so these guys take over in 1260. At the same point of time, we see the Mongols starting to intrude across the Euphrates, the destruction of Baghdad in 1258. And the Mongols are going to be an existential threat to the Islamic world. On the coast, we have the Crusader states who have lost Jerusalem, a whole dot of little kingdoms, but it's a very fragmented picture. There are still little Ayyubid princelings in Damascus and so on. But the driver forward at this point are going to be the Mamluks. And the Mamluks under one man, an extraordinary man, Baibars.
Yeah, so you mentioned especially the fragmentary nature. So this wasn't a unified kingdom, was it? It was a bunch of 2, 5, 10 different statelets, just with conflicting interests and conflicting diplomacy.
Yes, I mean we've got contests between different little mini states, if you like, Akka, Tripoli, and further up the coast. We've got a kind of rivalry between the Templars and the Hospitallers, who are the main military players in this. But we have different interests going on. We have Crusaders. We have people who want to trade with the Islamic world. We have Venetians and Genoese merchants in there who are, both providing the ships that are bringing Crusaders there, but are also providing war materials for the Islamic world. So we've got a whole hodgepodge of things going on that coastal strip, which is what they control. They've lost Jerusalem. They basically control a coastal strip, a very long coastal strip.
So is that why, for example, obviously the Crusades kind of started to peter out some time ago? There were still some, obviously, but they're not the big bang ones like the first and the second. What are we up to, like the 7th, the 8th, or the 9th by now or something?
Yeah, the Crusades are starting to falter for all sorts of reasons, which are really to do with people who've got other priorities. We're starting to see it's a long, slow decline of not faith, but in the idea of a unified Christendom. We're starting to see they're dependent upon the Venetians and the Genoese really to transport troops to the Holy Land. And really, we're starting to see the slow emergence of not of a unified Christendom, but of nation states, France, England, and all sorts of other options are open to people. You can go crusading against the Muslims in Spain. You can do your crusading bit and get your sins wiped out for crusading in the forests of Prussia and Lithuania against the sort of heathen peoples. So the whole climate is starting to change, really, and it really requires. There's no longer kind of unified will. These are little kind of like one-offs where you get sort of what you might call military tourism, where somebody, like Edward the Prince, who becomes Edward the First, sets off and takes some, 1,000 men to Akka and does a little bit of, rousing around and upsetting the natives, really, and then goes home again. And so you no longer have strategic management of this from any central point.
So it's a lot more tactical. It's not like it's seasonal almost, isn't it? You come in, you get your ticket to heaven, and then you head back home.
You go back home again. Yeah, you've got your badge. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is infuriating for the people on the ground, because all you've done is irritate some peasantry who might have been reasonably well disposed towards the Christian states. Anybody who looks like a Muslim is fair game. It might just be somebody hoeing a field, and you slaughter a few people, you go home, and really you're losing hearts and minds every time you do that.
Okay, so obviously, when did Jerusalem fall? By the way, how long ago was it retaken?
Well, I can't remember the exact date. The 1180s. Yeah.
Okay, so some time by now.
Yeah. They still maintain the fiction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. and which was really the little coastal strip of which Akka is the center, and it was the bishop of Jerusalem was located in Akka. So they had this kind of thing going on. At the same time, there was still some access for pilgrims to go to Jerusalem. And Akka was one of the landing points for that. And, they could be escorted by Islamic, guards at various points, depending on how hot or cold the temperature was at a certain point.
Brave new world, right? So is Akka very much the new capital then? That's the biggest city in all the Levant, is it?
Yes, it is, effectively. I mean, it's a population of about 40,000 people, many of whom are deeply settled there. These are, some of these people have been there since the First Crusades. I mean, their families have been. They're effectively Arabized in many ways. They speak Arabic. They are Christians, but they're very well integrated into the Islamic trading world of the Middle East, with Damascus and goods coming from further on. And they actually use the gold currency of the Middle East, which really irritates the Pope. So people arriving, a guy called Jacques de Vitry comes to be the bishop of Akka in about 1216. And he's horrified, all these people are dressed like Arabs. We're in the Middle East, mate. We're not in, France or something. He expects to find a completely European, and it's just not like that. And being a port town, it's a complete melting pot of peoples. You've got the Venetians, the Genoese, and the Pisans trading in there. You've got all kinds of strands of Christianity. You've got Muslim merchants coming to trade, and you've also got all the things that horrified him about a den of sin. This is a port town. It's got sailors in it. It's got all kinds of things. It's loggerheads with each other. There was a point in the 1260s when the Venetian and the Genoese compounds, which are next to each other, have a very vicious war where they're bombarding each other over walls with catapults. So it's pretty dysfunctional in terms of its management. Although nominally the king of Jerusalem is the king of this, the king is actually in Cyprus.
Right.
So there is no overall strategic management of this place. It's in the hands of various groups who you hope will cooperate. And the leaders in this really are the military orders, particularly the Templars and the Hospitallers, but also the Teutonic Knights, and there's a small English group as well. These are really the military sort of movers and shakers. But it's dysfunctional in terms of a working, cooperating, organized system.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on, so that person that you just spoke about before, I think I got this quote from your book. So when I entered this horrible city and had it found it full of countless disgraceful acts and evil deeds, I was very confused in my mind. That was him, was it? Answering
Poor old Jack. Yes, he was very confused. Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, it wasn't what he was turning out for at all, really. I mean, apart from anything else, he needed an interpreter to speak to quite a lot of the Christians there, because they were Arabic speakers, really. It's the Middle East. It's not, it's not, and it's a great trading center. I mean, it's well placed. If you've got Constantinople at the top and Alexandria at the bottom, it's a good stopping off point. Also, if you're trading east-west via Cyprus, it can bring goods in from the Western Europe. So it's a real Marco Polo set out from there on one of his, one of his dues. And it's got a very, very deep, it's a very ancient city. It's mentioned in the Bible, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, in the chronicles of the Assyrians. Alexander the Great passed through there. Cleopatra owned it for a bit. It's got a very deep history, very ancient history of a trading center.
Okay. And if we're talking about Akka, we can't not talk about some of the tower names, which is obviously where your book got one of them. So we've got some really great ones here. We've got the Accursed Tower, of course, the Tower of Blood, and the Tower of Flies. So can you tell me where these came from?
We also got the Gate of Evil Step.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's funny, actually. Of course, the answer is that we don't know the answer to most of those questions. The accursed tower probably came from, there's a backstory that's very important to what's going to happen to Akka in the 13th century, which is exactly 100 years before the siege that we're going to be talking about. There was a massive siege of Akka, which Saladin had captured. Richard the Lionheart, Richard I, turns up and besieges it. And this is a massive siege. It goes on for 600 days.
Wow.
And the critical point on the walls that where they were finding the going really difficult, I think that's what they call the accursed tower.
Right. Right.
And the end of that story is that in the end, there is a negotiated surrender by the garrison. It's very controversial, but according to Richard, Saladin went back on part of the deal, and Richard then marches the garrison out onto the plain and massacres them, 1,000 men. And this is remembered. This becomes, a cause really for Islam, and it's going to be remembered exactly 100 years later at the 1291 siege of the city.
Right. Doesn't really seem like, going by the kind of Western narrative of Saladin, he's meant to be seen as quite honorable and quite trustworthy and stuff. So I can see why that one's a bit controversial. Okay, in terms of, obviously, there's kind of, what I'm sensing is there was a bit of a build up towards this. Everyone kind of knew it was coming. Baybars, in a way, set the scene and put on a lot of the groundwork. Is it fair to say that prior to Baybars, the Muslim world around the Levant was a bit disorganized and fragmented as well? Or was that more
absolutely
unified?
Yeah, it was a complete basket case of little princelings, the Prince of Damascus, Cairo, all feuding with each other, sometimes cooperating with the Christians, actually. Baybars comes along, and as I say, these people are outsiders. The coup that takes place in 1260 is very unpopular with the local people in Cairo. But these are first generation converts to Islam. He's a very fervent Sunni Muslim. He's probably not a great Arabic speaker, actually. He's Turkish speaker, but he establishes an orthodox presence by doing really quite good deeds, really. Tax breaks in the city, charitable works, rebuilding mosques in both Cairo and in Damascus, and re-establishing a caliphate, a sort of like phony put-up job, because the real caliph had been killed in the Baghdad collapse of 1258. And he establishes a legitimacy, really. But what's really going to establish the legitimacy of the Mamluks in the Islamic world is the advance of the Mongols into Syria. They take Damascus. They've sacked Antioch, and this is an existential crisis for the Islamic world. And they send a message to Cairo saying, "We're coming for you next. Open your gates." At that moment, they get a slightly lucky break for one of two reasons, or possibly two reasons at the same time. The weakness of the Mongol system is that every time the Khan of Khan dies back in Mongolia, all the leading Khans have to gallop back for the succession process. And so Hulagu, I think he's called, the leading Khan of the Mongol group there, leaves. They also withdraw their horses over the Euphrates, and there's a reasonable case to say that actually they're operating at the limits, the ecological limits of what the Mongols could do, because they have a vast number of horses. And the grasslands of Syria, and the further south you go, the harder it is for them. But they leave a holding force of about 12,000 men. They go out to take him on with the help of some Egyptian troops, and they win. And at the Battle of Ain Jalut, which means the spring of Goliath.
Okay.
It's got a kind of like a really good name for this.
It does.
1258, and this is kind of this wins the the Mamluks enormous legitimacy within the Islamic world. It really is a badge for them. Baybars kills his rival Mamluk leader on the way back to Cairo and takes over. But this is a defining moment, that suddenly they are much more popular with the Arab-speaking Islamic world, and this is the launch pad really for Baybars to really take over, organize, unify, start to build a strong army, and then eventually take on the Christians.
So this must have been one of the first major losses for the Mongols, right? Starting to break that aura of invincibility almost.
Yes, it did. I think it broke the aura of invincibility, really. And rather than people just trembling and opening their gates or whatever, it was a break moment. I mean, it wasn't a big battle. They weren't taking on a vast Mongol horde, but it put fight into the Islamic world.
Okay, so was the intention made clear that with the Mongols kind of dealt with, Akka's going to be the next, it's coming next for Akka, or was it a bit of a surprise when they rocked up at the?
It wasn't a surprise, but there's a bit of a long run into this. Basically, Baybars spent several years building up his army, recruiting a much larger number of Mamluks, training. They had a great training ground in Cairo, military training ground, developing the logistical infrastructure for what's ahead. What is ahead really is taking fortified cities. And this requires a wholly different approach to open field warfare. You need supplies, you need equipment, you need catapults, you need miners. And what Baybars does over a period of time is knock out the forts. There's a chain of forts. They're not kind of like a Maginot line which is all kind of connected. They're all independently managed. And he worked out we can isolate these one at a time and take them out. And so he starts to take out these blocks around up the coast. At the same time, he tries to take coastal ports, because if you can deprive the Crusaders of landing places for replenishment from the west, you've done it. He takes Antioch very quickly in a huge massacre, and slowly he's moving in towards Akka. He managed warfare in an extraordinary way. I mean, he campaigned continuously for 17 years. Campaigns of misinformation. He would pitch up in front of the walls of a city and just frighten people and go away again. He'd make a truce with somebody and then break it. He had a long-term strategy, but he dies before we get to Akka. He takes Crac de Chevalier, possibly by forging a document for the Hospitallers inside from notionally from the master of the order, who's somewhere else, saying it's hopeless, we can't send you reinforcements, you better surrender now. And this massive and incredibly apparently amazing fort, which would have been taken a long time to take, just gives in. They never have very many men in these forts. At the same time, every time they do this, they take agricultural land round about, and so you're slowly destroying the hinterland of the ports of places like Akka and Tripoli and so on, where they were getting feudal revenues from the local peasantry, and also they were getting supplies and food. So that slowly you're boxing these people into isolated spots, cut off one from another.
I suppose with like the noose tightening around them, what did Europe do? Obviously, we've got these Italian trading companies, and we've got the Templars, which I guess were based. So the Templars and the Hospitallers, which I suppose were based on the Levant rather than back in Europe now, right?
Yeah. Yes, they were. Yeah. What did Europe do? Well, not a great deal. I mean, as I was saying, you get this sort of military tourism. Prince Edward, Edward I comes and does a bit. People came and went home. There were noises, back home from the papacy about the importance of supporting the Crusades, but not very much happens, quite honestly. It's getting harder to recruit organize crusading ventures, for the reasons that I've started to outline earlier on.
When they do get to the walls, what I read about is just, well, before we get to the trebuchets, the strength of both the forces. Can you tell me what the disparity was? Obviously, the defenders were at a bit of a disadvantage, but
yeah, the defenders are probably about 14. Population of the city probably about 40,000. About 14,000 fighting men, about 13,000 infantry, and about 800 mounted cavalry, who would have been Templar and Hospitaller and armored knights. It's always difficult to quantify the size of an Islamic army. People come up with all sorts of numbers, 100,000. What happened was you've got a core army, which might have been about 40,000. Then you get a lot of people who join up in the spirit. There's a very strong jihad thing going on here. Preaching in the mosques of Damascus, the memory of the Richard I massacre. So you get this very strong religious fervor to join the thing. So you get, a massive, large groups of hangers-on, really. You also get huge numbers of horses and wagons and so on. So it's quite difficult to come up with numbers, but I would think they probably could muster an army, an army of not whom are professional soldiers, are probably 60 or 70,000,
right,
for a short-term campaign.
Yeah, and obviously the advantage is there under the command of one person, theoretically, right, rather than being split into little groups. A few Hospitallers here, a few Templars here. Was inside Akka, did it have one overall commander, or was it just scattered?
No, it didn't. And of course, that was part of the problem. They did allocate various sections of the walls to different groups. So the Hospitallers were in one area, the Templars in two different areas. The English Knights fought in another area. Troops belonging to the King of Cyprus were somewhere else, but coordination wasn't terribly good, to be quite honest. There was no command and control of the whole thing.
Okay, so we get to go to my favorite bit now. So the trebuchets. So these were meant to be quite legendary, right? Both in the names and the size and the number of them, right?
Yeah. We don't know exactly how many they had, but somewhere between 72 and 92. And this is an incredible piece of a large trebuchet, incredible piece of practical engineering, effectively. The wood for the trebuchets had to be hauled from the Lebanon through mountain passes in the middle of winter. And they would then be erected. There were various different, there were the big monster machines, of which they probably had about 4 or 5, which all had names like the Victorious and the Furious and so on. These would have been counterweight trebuchets, where you'd have a huge bag of stones at one end and a large ball on the other, and you sort of tugged on a rope to release the weight, and it would fire the ball. The largest of these things were probably about sort of 2 feet across and weighed, I don't know what, 300 pounds. You've not only got to erect these things, this takes time. You've also got to have the ammunition for them. They were incredibly skillful. They knew a lot. What you need to do, if you need to hit the wall with something harder than the wall itself. And the limestone of Akka was of a certain type, but they mined and had masons constructing these balls at a site about 12 miles away, where the geology was slightly different. Then they had to be transported to the siege site, and so this is the logistical side of this. And to keep these things firing for long periods was phenomenal, actually. They only had, perhaps about 5 of these very, very large ones, and they had medium-sized ones, and then they had a small kind of anti-personnel ones, which were kind of almost like slingshots. And they did different jobs, really. When you see the kind of, movie thing where they smash the walls down, actually, even these large balls couldn't really do that. They had a slight psychological element, but what they were really constructed to do was to destroy the tops of battlements, i.e. Any protection for defending men. Then the smaller anti-personnel ones were designed to keep people ducking, so that this is a combination of really two elements. One is artillery bombardment, and the other is mining. Mining, you've got to get close to the walls. So what you do is you try and put up a vast salvo of ammunition to keep people ducking down behind the walls. You advance closer and closer with screens. And sometimes they put up great big leather screens like sails to try and, to stop weapons coming in until you've got close enough to the moat. At that point, you need miners. The Mamluks come to this siege with 1,000 miners from Aleppo, very skilled job, who dig these very narrow tunnels. There are three sort of specialist roles there. There are guys who dig the tunnels, there are guys who move the spoil, and there are guys who prop the tunnels as they go along. You need wood to prop the tunnels. So, these are huge ergonomic activities requiring lots of men, lots of organization and so on. The aim is not to get into the city, but you get to a point when you're under a tower, you enlarge it, the area into a sort of small room, and then you get specialist guys come in with wood, set fire to it, and then hopefully collapse the tower. So, and the third part of this really is that when you've degraded one way or another enough wall, then you have the all-out assault. The Islamic armies never went in for starvation, long-term sieges. They went for the knockout blow, that you can keep an army and the people together for about 6 weeks. After that, people drift away. Also, the logistics of managing food, hygiene, latrines, to prevent illness and so on. The longer you're there, the more likely are your people are going to get sick. So really the maximum really period, and the same with the Ottomans for a siege, would be about 6 or 7 weeks. So and that was the pattern really. Degrade the walls, undermine them, and then you put people in, and you're quite prepared to lose quite a lot of people in the final attack. And very often what would happen is I think there's some evidence that at this siege they did have some Christians that they captured who they'd promised to, all sorts of things too, but they had to go in the front wave and probably be killed. And then there would be probably a sort of rabble of people fired up by jihad who would also be prepared to martyr themselves in the front line. And your more experienced troops would follow up behind. And that would be the kind of 3-part strategy for an Islamic siege. And the Acre siege is quite typical of that.
Right. So you've got all these kind of different groups working in tandem, almost like a modern army where you've got, the drones and the strike force on the ground and stuff like that. Okay, so can you tell me a bit about the man who was kind of, because Baybars is now dead and gone, and we're with someone called, let me get this right, Al-Ashraf Khalil, is that right?
Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah. He was, Baybar's successor was a guy called Calawan, and Calawan was planning this siege, but he died. And the Khalil is his son. He was the second son, and not quite so popular, I think, as the first son. He had enemies. In many respects, the Mamluk dynasties are a basket of snakes, really, with sub-tribal groups and so on. But he was better integrated. He was a fluent Arabic speaker, personally very brave, but he needs to win to maintain the loyalty of quite a devious bunch of other Mamluk lords. So failure is not an option, really. Probably going to be killed by somebody else if you don't. And obviously, the great kudos will come if you take this city. So he's the guy who's planning, and he was probably a good military strategist, I think.
So this is your legitimacy almost is built upon this siege being successful in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So while you've got obviously these scattered Christian forces under attack, are there any kind of, overall heroes? I think I read about someone, Jean de Villiers, was a bit of a rallying point.
Jean de Villiers, who was the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, and Guillaume de Beaujeu, who was the Grand Master of the Templars, and also a guy called Matthew de Clermont. These people stand out because the sources are not good for what's happening within the city, particularly towards the end, because a lot of people died. And it could be that these people were picked out because, they were the masters of those orders. Another man who was very important, actually, was the patriarch of the city, a man called Nicolas de Hanapes, who really rallied people to this is a Christian cause, who would bring people to church before the final attacks and so on, and tell them that they're dying for God. And he put a lot of courage, I think, and spiritual, can do, if you like. That's, I don't know, spiritual can do is really a concept, but into the whole thing. So he was very important in raising morale and keeping morale up. Yeah. So I mean, the undoubtedly the leaders are the Grand Masters, or there's a Grand Master and then a Marshal. Grand Master is the Marshal is probably somebody who's actually more militarily in control, but the Grand Masters fought and died. Villiers was wounded and escaped. Beaujeu was killed or died of his wounds, and Mathieu de Clermont fought until his horse was shot from under him, and he was shot also.
Yeah, the impression I got, especially around the death of Villiers, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, from reading your book, it seemed like that was kind of a bit like the final straw where, the defense was kind of starting to waver. It reminded me a lot about, the fall of Constantinople with Giovanni, is it
Giustiniani?
Giustiniani, yes.
Yeah. I think iconic figures are very important. I think both Villiers, who was wounded, and Beaujeu, who was badly wounded and said, I can't fight on, and was taken back into the into the Templars castle where he died. These are undoubtedly, iconic figures, critical really to the morale of the troops, really leading from the front. And I think that if your head guy gets killed or severely wounded, then these blows are taken very, very seriously. And I think it definitely affected the morale of the men. I mean, they did pretty well. On the 16th, the final siege on the 18th. On the 16th, they repulsed a major attack. And this actually was a moment of crisis for Khalil, because if he doesn't do it, he's in serious trouble, really. And they regrouped for a day, and on the 18th they came again, where almost exactly 100 years after the capture of Acre by the Christians. So
wow.
There's a symmetry here. They were really fired up for this final thing. And Ottoman armies, when they make this final attack, as I said, they send the cannon fodder in first. You advance on a vast wall of noise. The Ottoman armies also had these huge military bands with camel drummers and trumpets and so on to inspire the men. A massive wall of sound, really. When the accursed tower fell, which was at a very critical point in the walls, then they at that point they degraded enough of the wall that they could get in between the inner and outer walls, and then start to open gates, and then the street to street fighting.
So there wasn't any because the story of Constantinople, there's that probably untrue story that a little gate was left open and that's how they got in. I don't think there's any historical truth to that.
No, I don't know, but that one was sort of questionable. But no, I mean at Akka they had just degraded enough of the wall to be able to attack and enter at several different points. And once they got into the city, I think you've been to Akka, haven't you?
I have, yeah.
These very, very narrow streets.
Mm.
You had the citizens sort of raining rocks down on them, but they were very disciplined in the way that they advanced, bit by bit, forcing their way, forcing people back. They also had quite a large number of incendiary weapons, sort of like hand grenades of Greek fire that they could throw at people. And there's stories of people just going out like a sort of human wick, from being hit by these things. So yeah, and then the defense collapsed, and then it's a massacre. People run to the harbor. The weather had been very stormy, and it'd been difficult. Quite a number of people had left, actually, were quite well before the final attack, but there aren't many galleys there. And there's this guy who gets command of a galley called Roger de Flor, who will only take wealthy people with their treasures onto the ships. So the wealthier tend to get away, as is the way in these things, in their helicopters or whatever. The rank and file are left to be killed or enslaved or raped or whatever. And it's pretty ghastly.
I guess the kind of standard for a sack is what, 3 days or so of sacking that occurs after. Was there clemency? Was there anything like that? Was it more brutal than usual?
I think what happened was that initially you slaughter people. After a little while, what happens is you stop slaughtering people and you capture them because they're valuable. They can be slaves. You might have killed, monks and nuns in churches and so on. But at that point, you're after the stuff, really. There's no real armed opposition, apart from the retreat into the Templars' castle on the seashore.
What was the reaction from the rest of the Christian world?
There was a huge amount of blame culture really flung at, particularly actually at the military orders for not having, we support you. You're incredibly wealthy. You should have, done it really. A lot of hand wringing, a lot of plans for further crusades. But as I said earlier, the appetite for crusading is dying for all sorts of reasons. The plans are hatched, money is raised and then disappears into people's pockets. It kind of lingers on as a sort of motif throughout the 14th century. Of course, other things happen in Europe. In the 14th century, the Black Death hits Europe in 1340s, and this kind of rather distracts people from all sorts of other things. And there was sort of existential fear, really, I think, as there was with the fall of Constantinople, that the Antichrist is coming, really, and soul searching about sin and why did God allow this to happen and so on. But it's starting to taper away, the whole Crusader thing. Very slowly over a long period of time.
I did read that there was a little holdout. I think it's in Ruad or something like that fell about 10 years later. That was just a little town, and that was the very last one, right?
Yes, I think that was a little offshore island, I think, that held out for a little while. There was a little bit of crusading went on in what they call Cilician Armenia, which is not Armenia at all. It's the south coast of Turkey, and goes on afterwards. But little areas, little pockets. The fallback to Cyprus, was really the position from which people dreamt of new crusades. But of course, what happens is the Templars are demolished. Really heart of the crusading thing is France. The Templars are really based in France. They're massively wealthy. There's the grab of their land and the persecution and the torture and the execution of a lot of Templars. Really, unfortunately, their raison d'etre really was to be Crusaders, and they didn't have a foothold left from which to operate. Then people looked at them with greedy eyes, and the dismantling of the Templars is a horrible story of the King of France grabbing their stuff, torturing them into saying they were in league with the devil and so on. The Hospitallers were a bit smarter.
Mm.
They went and took over the Christian island of Rhodes, and held out there, and then retreated when that fell, and the Ottomans to Malta. And so they really kept themselves going in a kind of increasingly decadent way until Napoleon comes and takes them out in Malta in the end of the 18th century. But so the end of those crusading orders, really, it's all gone. And the Venetians and the Genoese are not going to lend ships to transport the Crusaders anymore. Thank you very much. They're far too busy trading for spices with the Mamluks in Alexandria and Cairo, for which they get a lot of black marks from the papacy. But that was what they were. So it's a slowly dying thing, really. It's a slowly dying thing.
I mean, I suppose with no real port anymore, where would you even drop them off? If you were going to start a new crusade, you don't have Akka as a foothold anymore. There's no Antioch, there's no Alexandria, nothing like that now.
No, there isn't. And I think they worked quite hard to destroy the ports. I think they dumped a lot of rocks in the harbor of Akka. And everywhere they went, they tried to destroy port infrastructure so that there was no foothold for them to land. Yeah.
And you've visited yourself, obviously. As I pointed out to you when we first chatted, all I could see was I can't believe I picked it, to be honest, the Tower of Flies, or a couple of rocks of it left in the coast. But is there much else? There's obviously the Templar Fortress still. Is there any other sites that really took your eye?
Well, the hospitalers HQ.
It must be what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah, is a great thing. The extraordinary underground tunnel that connected the Templars' castle, which had disappeared under the water, with the port. Apart from that, it's fragments, really. It's fragments of bits of Venetian and Genoese stuff. It's a fascinating collection of bits, really. I mean, the most disappointing thing is there are fantastic walls around the city, but they were built in the late 18th century, and the archaeologists have been trying to find out what the walls were like, but they've all gone. I think all the stone was taken away and used for building other stuff or rebuilding the new walls. So it's kind of a bit frustrating, but it is fascinating, a little honeycomb, really, of very intense. I think you get a feeling of what it would have been like as a place, because I think a lot of the streets were really a footprint of the streets of the old town. It has, I think, maintained some of the feeling of what this city would have been like in Crusader age.
In terms of an open-ended question for you, what do you think would have happened if they had have held out? If the siege had have failed, what's your prediction for the Levant and the Crusader states?
Well, I think Calla would have lost his head. Actually, he did lose his head about 3 years later.
Didn't even help.
It didn't. They were holding on by their fingernails, really. And I think that another powerful Baybars-like figure would have emerged. Yeah, Akka was all there was, really. Tripoli had gone, Antioch had gone, various other handy little ports, a place called Arsuf had gone. I think they couldn't have held out for very long, quite honestly. I think it wasn't viable, really.
Well, I guess if you were going to kind of war game up a scenario, could you ever see the Crusaders, the states reconquering Jerusalem, reconquering Antioch, and gaining the coastline back?
No. No matter
what.
I think that day had gone. The appetite for crusading was fading.
Just wasn't
away.
there.
Yeah, it just wasn't there anymore. So, yeah. So I think it was the last stand. It was that kind of heroic moment when they go down. They more or less go down to the last man. There was a certain amount of survivor guilt. Rather like surviving the Titanic. Jean de Villiers survived. How dare you come back out of this alive, kind of thing.
I guess if
gone down with his ship. Down with his ship, and of course, most of the people who did survive were wealthier, and I don't think Villiers was carried off by by his men, and probably didn't have much choice. And odd little stories, really. Sort of about, I can't remember how long it was. Like 40 years later, somebody came across some woodcutters, sort of by the Sea of Galilee, who were Templars, who had survived, had kind of Islamicized, some Arabic speaking. It was like finding a sort of a lost extinct species.
Yeah.
And had married local women, and they were taken back as kind of specimens to the papal court at Avignon, and we're probably, like we found this extraordinary kind of
this animal,
lost species, like a small dinosaur
that's bizarre.
in Jurassic Park or something.
Yeah.
And they were probably completely freaked out. So you glimpse these extraordinary little human tales of people who survived, strange little stories of survival. And what grieved me about this story was that I wanted the sources to be, I wanted more eyewitness. I like eyewitness accounts.
Me too.
And I had to really graft for them. There were I had to translate two whole works from Latin to kind of get little bits of stuff out of, really. Not enough people that survived to tell the tale, really, or possibly were too traumatized to tell the tale.
Maybe 10 years from now, the Vatican will open up their archives and we'll get all the rest of it stuffed away down there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we look forward to it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, thanks very much for talking to me about that, Roger. That was really fascinating. And I'm really glad we could elaborate on what was in the book. Really appreciate your time just coming on and chatting with me.
Thank you very much. It made me reread my book, and I really enjoyed my book.
That's good. Me too. It's been about 10 years since I looked through it. So.
Yeah. Oh, I wrote that book today. Yeah.
I forgot about that one.
Yeah, I've forgotten all the slog.